So we are continuing, of course, obviously through the tail end now of Deuteronomy chapter 20. For our visitors, we've been going through an expository series now week by week, of course, with various different breaks and interludes throughout for, I think, about 3 years now through the book of Deuteronomy. And we've been traversing, subdividing each of the sections, of course, going through. Today, we're actually closing off that chapter, as you can well tell, verses 19 and 20. To recap, again, many of you have been here in previous weeks, but to fill in, we've been going through this very, very interesting section, chapter 20, which serves to transition us out of a bulk section of the previous couple of chapters, really the end of chapter 16, then all of 17 and 18 and 19, onto what will then come in the coming chapters regarding particular commands, civic commands, things like this, in chapters 21 and beyond, in this section which is called the Deuteronomic Code. The explication and ultimately the application of the law of God that is given between chapters 12 and 26 here in the book of Deuteronomy. This particular chapter, to remind you, has really been following all in the context of warfare. We covered the first 9 verses, essentially 1 to 9, of this chapter a fortnight ago. Last week we were looking at verses 10 through 18, all of which was dealing respectively with, in that first passage, the opening portion of these exceptions that are given. We're actually going to reference one of them later on from verse 6, I believe. These exceptions that were given for military service in the ancient Israelite kingdom, namely revolving around those young men who had just been married and had not started a family with their wife, those who had built a house which they had not yet, of course, lived in and owned and stewarded, as well as then also a vineyard being the example given. But in essence, basically the nature of property being used for labour and to provide for and ultimately protect your own family. Those young men who had not known those things, who had just started out in life, were actually given an exemption until they had then, as we might say, lived a little, but in the not so macabre sense or salacious sense, lived their early years of life, actually known and enjoyed for the purpose of, ultimately as the conclusion was drawn, by virtue of the fourth and final exemption, those who were weak in spirit, weak in heart, those who would cause their brothers' hearts to melt is the ancient aphorism that's used, in other words, cowards. Okay? The young men who had not known their wife, had not known family, had not known household and business and these kinds of things, did not ultimately have an experiential appreciation, at least, for that which they were fighting for. They could be blinded by the zeal of journey and adventure, as soldiers and warriors have been known to do throughout history. They could be blinded by the cause of ideology and allegiances, perhaps even erroneous ones, whilst not being able to, as the biblical saying goes, even in other spiritual matters, count the cost. That then flowed through to what we saw last week, okay, which was one of these archetypal passages, really, that gives the direct, unfiltered, unvarnished brutality of warfare and the nature of it. And a lot was spent last week, obviously, explaining not only the reality of war in the world, but particularly the actual ethos behind why the command was given to besiege a city, if and when they do, like, for example, Jericho, many of you may be familiar with from the book of Joshua. But when doing so, there were rules, or as we would say, laws of war, that would guide and govern the righteous execution of warfare against the enemies of God. And therein, when and if, but again, usually when, the enemies of God would wage war against you, there was the command specifically given for the land of Canaan, not necessarily for anyone else, but for Canaan as the target, to bring down destruction upon them for centuries and centuries and centuries of horrific sins and the entire enculturation. This here today seems like, again, one of those passages that's easy to keep in its ancient context, in its antique context, we might say, right? Literally in the sense of antiquity. Prohibitions about cutting down trees. And we, of course, come here thousands of years later and go, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China, as the expression goes? Why is it, or indeed how on earth, are we even able to learn from a command at a specific time to a specific people through a specific person, in this case the prophet Moses, about rules concerning scorched earth and horticulture? Well, as we've hopefully become accustomed to and acquainted with throughout our journey in the book of Deuteronomy, the ways in which we can not only just see and read what is being said, but more importantly, draw out the, as we know now, principle of the law, the spirit of the law, the general equity of the law, in that more technical term, that has a perennial application in and through to the New Testament, to that of now the New Covenant. We have done that with passages and even simple verses, like we've had, for example, with the prohibition against boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. And you saw me do what is hopefully the job of any faithful preacher, which is be able to see in wisdom what this means for all of God's people throughout time. Of course, in that case, it was the prohibition against taking that which God has designed for life and transforming it into a tool to be wielded for death. This here, which trees to cut down and to not cut down, will hopefully as well give us actually a very deep and profound point. Now, my purpose for explaining to you in this introduction those previous two passages that we've looked at, right, verses 1 through 9 and 10 through 18, is not just merely to fill you in. It is instead to show us how and why this is bringing to a climax, or a culmination, we might say, what we've been looking at through these various weeks. As there was a distinction drawn last week between combatants and non-combatants, okay? So in other words, the women and the children are to be spared, right? But anyone who chooses to remain in the city, or indeed if the entire city just chooses to declare war on you, they are now enemy combatants, right? So the actual moral distinction between what we call in technical terms combatants and non-combatants is the Christian ethos of war. We are not just simply like Mongols to raid through an entire village and R-A-Z-E, raze it to the ground, okay? Scorched earth, right? We are not simply to rape the women, to slaughter the kids, to pillage everything in sight. That was the command that was being given to the ancient Israelites. Here, a similar kind of bifurcation, or in other words, a distinction, is being drawn here between the trees that are able or allowed to, permitted by God to be used for, of course, building the various technologies and weapons of war, right? In ancient warfare, especially up until the modern day of industrialized warfare, wood was the single most important asset, quite frankly, in much of warfare, even up until the 19th century. All the great ships like the man-of-war and the brigs and the frigates that made up the mightiest navy in the history of the world, the Royal Navy, right? The British Navy, could have and often would have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of trees required to build them. The famous HMS Victory, which Lord Horatio Nelson, of course, sailed at the famous Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, had 6,000 trees utilised to build that mighty vessel, which still sits in Portsmouth, England. This command is being given, however, to delineate a particular kind, that which is given for food, or specifically fruit. Okay? Even as we read the words before us, beginning in verse 19. If you besiege a city for many days to make war against it in order to capture it, you shall not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them. For you may eat from them, and you shall not cut them down. Okay? So the delineation of eating is implying fruit trees. Okay? For is the tree, and this is the interesting rhetorical question thrown at the end of verse 19. For is the tree of the field a man that it should besiege you? In other words, has this inanimate object assaulted you and assailed against you? The answer, of course, to that very obvious question is no. But this is not being asked wantonly. It is not just simply a silly, childish question that poses a very, very obvious answer of the fact that unless we're in some magical fantasy novel where the trees are alive and moving and talking, these trees have done nothing against you. This is in fact asking something which is going to become quite apparent to us, hopefully, as we work our way through here. Only the trees that you know are not trees for food, you shall destroy and cut down, that you may build siege works, right? Things like siege engines and other military equipment and instruments utilized for besieging a city, against that city which is making war with you until it falls. Okay? To start off, see the distinction. Fruit trees, in essence, and all manner of other trees which are not for eating, right? Which are not able to be eaten from. Okay, they do not bear fruit. The non-fruit bearing trees, I'm going to try and keep using that term fruit bearing to make it obvious. The non-fruit bearing trees you are able to cut down, you're able to put the axe to, right? To then utilize as lumber. The ones that bear fruit, however, you are not to cut down because they have not assaulted against you. Now, a very logical question, which might well be posed in counter to this, is, well, what on earth has the tree that does not bear fruit done against me? Has not the tree that, like we of course well know here in our World Heritage listed national park, bears no fruit, and yet it has not in fact actually opened fire upon us? It has not wielded the battle axe or the war hammer or the sword against any one of us. So what is the distinction that is being drawn? Is it merely the fact of that hypothetical, which of course is posed there at the end of verse 19, that this tree has not in fact come alive, right? As silly as that might sound. No, that is the addendum or the auxiliary point that is being drawn to the different categories. Okay? Trees that bear fruit, trees that do not. Right? Trees that are, in the short and simple wording, fruitful. Okay? Now, this is something which has already actually been hinted at and highlighted here in the book of Deuteronomy. It's important perhaps to remind us of what I'm referring to, right? Keep a bookmark, keep a finger, whatever you need to in chapter 20 here. But flick back with me, if you would, to Deuteronomy chapter 6, just to remind you, again, for those who have been here, what this is referring to, or to even show you for the first time what this is, in fact, picking up on. Because there is an inherent promise that is given here by the Lord concerning, among many other things, that which he is referring to here in the end of chapter 20. Okay? So back in Deuteronomy 6, and this is actually not the only place, in fact, it's repeated again, just in slightly different wording, in chapter 7, but we're just going to talk about the one in chapter 6 for simplicity's sake, right? Verse 10 through 13 of Deuteronomy chapter 6. Then it will be that the Lord your God, when he brings you into the land, which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you great and good cities, which you did not build. Of course, Deuteronomy chapter 20 is referring directly to those things. Verse 11, and houses full of good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. And you will eat and be satisfied. Okay. Even if we just end there, variety of categories, but what does the categorizations end with? Vineyards and olive trees. Now, vineyards were referenced already back for us in chapter 20. Okay, one of the three exempt categories for the young men in the army, right? Those who had planted a vineyard and not yet reaped the harvest. Okay, a vineyard is obviously a stand-in for any manner of things. It's not like anyone who was not a winemaker was out of luck and had to get put on the front lines, right? But the vineyard is given as the prime example of this. Okay, because of the images that have already been referenced back here in, among other places, chapter 6. Now again, God does not merely or flippantly or wantonly use these kinds of examples. These are here for a particular purpose. And when we covered this passage way back in chapter 6, obviously we were dealing with a variety of things, including those other categorizations. But the thing that is directly relevant now for us, having come 14 chapters later, is precisely what's referenced back here. Because this command, or really it's not so much a command, this instruction, the command is given in the following verses afterward. But the setting up, the context of the command, which is these verses that we just had read, verses 10 and 11 particularly, set up ultimately what come for us in our passage of Deuteronomy 20, verses 19 and 20. Vineyards, olive trees. The vineyards, where the grapes are grown, the wine is produced, the covenant sign of blood, okay, of sacrifice ultimately. And that of the olive tree, the very same which is then used to make oil, the oil that anoints kings and priests in the Old Testament. Right? You have the chief sign in terms of the agricultural, horticultural scene of sacrifice and anointing. Okay? These trees have particular symbolism and imagery directly attached to them, right? That extend obviously beyond just their actual practical use. Okay? It is not an either or, but a both and. So the practical aspect of viticulture and the making of wine, as well as also the production of oil to anoint. Okay? It is the wine that is drunk in the cups during the Day of Atonement. It is the very wine that produces, again, that chief image of the sacrificial blood of the Lamb in the Old Testament, which of course flows through and translates into what? The cup of the Lord in Holy Communion. It is the oil which anoints those chosen by God to serve him. It is the symbol of the anointing of the Holy Spirit. It is the symbol that indeed also in the literal sense, kings and priests, as I mentioned, were anointed with, right? In which the grace of God may be conferred in regard to healing, so on and so forth, right? These things are not to be cut down because, of course, the various different trees and other such things like the vineyard, like the olive tree, etc., are all that which produce fruit. They are, in a simple phrase or term, signs of covenant blessing. Okay? They are signs of covenant blessing. In one form or another, they feature, and there's obviously more than just the vineyard and the olive tree. But alas, these kinds of categories of trees and the fruit-bearing nature of them have various and manifold ways in which they are emblemized and symbolized, both Old and then, of course, New Covenant. Okay? But there's an important thing that is mentioned in chapter 6 that gives us a key piece of the puzzle for chapter 20. The repetition of the phrase, that which you did not build, that which you did not hew, that which you did not grow. Okay? In other words, this was, or these were, I should say plural, things which were being given, unearned by the grace of God to the Israelites. These were the homes built by the Canaanites. These were the cisterns hewn by the Canaanites. These were the vineyards, the olive trees, et al., planted by the Canaanites, to now be taken from the wicked and given to the righteous. Ergo, as even the Proverbs say, the riches of the wicked are stored up for the righteous. It's talking about things like the conquest of Canaan. And again, we covered much of that baseline judicial justification for that last week primarily, right? We're not focusing on that here today because of what verses 10 through 18 in chapter 20 are dealing with, right? A culture that has for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries descended further and further into the horrors of pagan darkness, which has by this point had the cup of its wrath filled up, and God is now prepared to give them no further time to turn and repent. Now is the days of justice, in which children will stop being slaughtered, in which women will stop being raped, in which demons will stop being worshipped, all these kinds of manifold cultural degeneracies and evils which the ancient Canaanites are well known to have practiced. But even amidst a land filled with the darkness of the horrors of Canaan, it is not as if God in his totality has somehow failed. Because ultimately the command for us in chapter 20 at the end there, distinction between fruitful and non-fruitful trees, right? Fruitless, I suppose you'd say, is that even in a land consumed with darkness, consumed with evil, consumed with pain and suffering and wickedness, there were still, in this case, pardon the pun, seeds of the good. Not every single quarter of Canaan was totally gone. And the reality is that that is not by virtue of anything the Canaanites did or did not do. It is in fact something actually far deeper and more profound. Something also far more interesting. certainly in the philosophical sense, which is that even in spite of the manifest wickedness of the Canaanites, there was still the inherent goodness underlying that of the created order of God, even in the land of Canaan. The vineyards are still good for producing the beautiful wines that are able to be enjoyed, that are able to be utilized in service and sacrifice unto God. The olive trees are able to provide the beautiful satiation in terms of the culinary variety, as well as, of course, the religious function of anointing. These don't change. No matter how evil the people have become, the fundamental and inherent goodness of God's creation, of his created order, remains. Because the power of mankind's wickedness is not greater than the creative goodness of the Almighty. It gives us really, ultimately, through these words, short and pithy as they are, verses 19 and 20, a silver lining, one might say, to the tougher, at least for us, tougher texts that come before it in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy. It gives something of a light of hope that shines out of this. Because, of course, one could read, particularly verses 15 through 18, which is kind of the second half, right? 10 to 14, roughly speaking, the distinction between combatants, non-combatants, right? In the general command for war, anywhere for the Israelites. But for Canaan, those distinctions were, as an exception to the rule, removed for a specific and particular case regarding the Canaanites. Right? No, it is to all be destroyed. Right? It has corrupted and degenerated and decayed to such a degree. But that does not go for everything in the land of Canaan. Right? It is the heart of man from which the great evils and sins of the world, of course, are born. Spurred on by the curse of sin, incumbent and inherent upon the human condition, inflamed by the manifold temptations of demons and the powers of darkness, to entice man, of course, as they have ever since the ancient serpent did whisper unto Eve in the garden. But all of that comes, even if we talk about in the chronological sense in Genesis, after God has indeed created the order of the world and declared it very good. Right? We've talked many times, of course, in Bible studies and even in church history, right? We are not Gnostics, okay? As the ancient heresy that has consistently beset the church on and off for 2 millennia and counting, right? We do not fundamentally believe that the creation is inherently evil and it is something to be escaped from. That we are to seek this higher realm of paradise or the ideal or various other conceptualizations, ancient and modern, right? Some form of utopia apart from or beyond the material, right? We are not Gnostics. We reject the heresy of Gnosticism, as all Christians have for 2,000 years. We instead hold this in balance. We do not go the opposite direction into the materialism of atheism and Enlightenment secularism, right? Which denies the spiritual, the abstract, the philosophical, the theological, and says that the only thing in existence is the concrete, right? Reducing human beings down to nothing more than blind automatons and aimless chemicals flowing through the grey matter of your cranium, right? The brain, internally in that cranium. No, we hold both in balance, which is precisely what this is doing. This recognizes, and by this I mean, verses 19 and 20 of Deuteronomy 20. This recognizes something that's extremely essential for any Christians, including us even today, to understand, which is humanity is the source of the evils, even when those evils spill out, inevitably and invariably as they do, into the world around. Because, of course, we as human beings, we use things, we live, we move, we build, we do all manner of things. Right? And what we do with those various skills and talents that as human beings we do either individually or collectively have, inevitably and invariably does not change the fact that the creation is itself good. Not because of us, but because of He who made it. So the danger here would be simply reducing these words of verses 19 and 20 down to kind of the baseline rudimentary command against scorched earth tactics in the context of warfare. Right? If this were some lecture at a military college, say at Duntroon, then perhaps that might be relevant. But for us here, this aspect of the tree gives us something even deeper as well, not necessarily based on the words that we get, for example, for us in Deuteronomy 20, but rather the wording that comes to us from that previous chapter that we mentioned, Deuteronomy 6. I'll remind you again what it says. From verse 10 onward, and really essentially it's just verse 10. Then it will be when the Lord your God brings you into the land which He swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you great and good cities which you did not build, etc., 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 vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you will eat and be satisfied. Now there are two very big things going on here, one at the beginning, one at the end. Okay? This is the land, these are the things, including in our direct relevance, the trees, the fruit trees, the fruitful trees, which the Lord your God swore to your fathers. That is an important detail. In fact, one with which you will not, at least fully, comprehend Deuteronomy 20, 19 and 20. This is that which God swore faithfully unto the patriarch Abraham, unto your ancestors. He's talking to them here. Okay? This is, of course, referring to Canaan as they themselves are on the eastern side of the Jordan River, overlooking the land which they are about to march upon. This is the land in which your own ancestor Abraham once resided in. It is before a very tree, in the case of the oaks of Mamre, wherein he met the Lord, wherein he hosted, he who is referred to as the angel of the Lord, which we know from the revelation of the New Testament is He, Christ Himself, in the pre-incarnate theophany, right, a presentation of the Lord, or appearance. Okay? He hosted the Almighty. All these various things. This is the land which, when Abraham was brought there after his some 1,000-mile journey across the ancient Mesopotamian world from the land of Babylonia and ancient Sumeria by those points, actually 4,000 years ago. He arrives in the land which, of course, the Lord refers to as the land of milk and honey. Right? Now, milk and honey were not exactly things Canaan was known for in any specific economic trade sense per se. Right? These are important descriptors for a land flowing with that which is for life and healing. Milk for life, we even referenced earlier, right? That famous passage, or I suppose that odd one that I mentioned, right? That we preached on about you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay? Milk representing life, nourishment, nutrition. Okay? Honey representing healing. Honey being used in ancient times for healing, for salves and various other things. Right? All these things. This is the land which Abraham stood in and lived in and was promised. What here he is doing, and by he I mean now Moses, is he is reminding the people of something. Okay? The question then, of course, is what? Other than the blind fact of the trees. What he is really calling the Israelites to do in this context is to remember. Remember that which God has promised. Remember the past. Remember the trees which your own ancestors once stood beneath. Because this is what I am now giving you. Not because you have earned it, not because you deserve it. In fact, it was the opposite, right? We know that from their time in the wilderness in the book of Numbers. No, I am giving it to you because this is that which I swore to your forefathers. And unlike us as God's people, He, God, is faithful, unfailingly, unflinchingly, perfectly, and indeed consummately. And this idea of remembering, right, it's kind of incumbent in repeating commands, right? He's already said it in chapter 6. He's now saying it again, just in a different way, in chapter 20, right? This kind of repetition is to remind the people. But that reminder is not just simply because, I don't know, they have the memory of a goldfish, or they can't really remember words and numbers and everything else in between. They perhaps have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, it's been a long time, right? No, this is not what's being done. You must understand this, that of course, as you read those early chapters of Exodus, or if you go back further into the book of Genesis itself, more importantly, you will see eventually the descendants of Abraham, particularly through his great-grandson Joseph and others, end up in Egypt. And they spend 430 years in Egypt, and they're enslaved for 150 of those years, right? By the time we come to the beginning of the book of Exodus, in the opening chapters, where of course the Lord appears unto Moses, most famously in chapter 3 in the burning bush at Sinai. Moses, a prince of Egypt by adoption, a Hebrew ethnically, has to ask this deity what his name is. Right? If you're familiar with that chapter, you might recall what I'm referring to, right? Whom shall I say unto the people has sent me? Right? Who are you? What name shall I give to them? Because the reality is that neither Moses nor the Hebrews, the Israelites, rightly called by this point, even remember the God of Abraham. Do you understand? They have literally and figuratively forgotten him. They do not know him. They don't worship him. They're totally ingratiated and enculturated, to use the literal term, in Egyptian culture and worship. Right? There are elements of distinction between them and the Egyptians, right, by virtue of their own enslavement, but culturally speaking, they are overwhelmingly assimilated. Okay? This is why even he who is called Moses, again, this is not a Hebrew name. This is an Egyptian name. Right? Moses' own adopted grandfather was the mighty Pharaoh Thutmose III. Right? Moses' name is Egyptian. Okay? They don't remember this God. They have forgotten him. But this God had not forgotten them. What he is calling them to do through the entire Exodus, through the wandering in the wilderness, is the purging of all things Egyptian and the remembering, not just in the cognitive sense, but really in the spiritual sense, the remembering of who the God of their fathers is. Not merely who he was, who he is. For indeed, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. They're calling, or they're being called, I should say, to remember. Because these trees that they are commanded to not cut down are the very same promised to Abraham. They are the vineyards, they are the olive trees, they are etc., the very signs of blessing and covenantal faithfulness that God had sworn by his name, not any other, by his name in heaven to give to the faithful. Even that aspect plays into something that goes well beyond Abraham, even unto that of the garden itself. Because that verse that I mentioned from Deuteronomy 6, right, where he mentions the vineyards and the olive trees which you did not plant, the ending of verse 11, and you will eat and be satisfied. That is intentionally echoing the language of Genesis 2 and 3. Right? You may eat of any of the trees of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Right? Eat and be satisfied. right? Satisfied literally meaning to be fulfilled, to have everything that you need, to be satiated purely in the sense of the appetite, but it's deeper than the mere material, it's also the spiritual sense, right? These things are satisfactory. They are, to use a bit of a better term here, sufficient. It is a call not only to remember the promise to Abraham, but to remember the Edenic state as well. Now that presents us as Christians, even thousands of years later, with something that is of great value and importance. It presents us with something that provides a paradigm or a framework, we might say, by which and through which to actually perceive like circumstances. What do I mean? The land of Canaan, as I mentioned earlier, replete and filled with wickedness and with evil, drowning in the darkness of paganism. But, as I also mentioned, the inherent goodness of the creation and the order that God has created, which is really what that's meaning, yet remains. Because, as trite as this might sound, God is not so incompetent as to allow the Canaanites to totally and completely ruin everything that he made. What this means is that ultimately the Israelites were not to come in and to wipe everything in Canaan off the face of the earth, to condemn it in the totality. No, they were to, as per verses 10 through 18, or really specifically 15 through 18, purge the evil and to redeem the land of Canaan. Because, of course, of all the lands on earth, where is it that in the Old Covenant God built his temple? Well, in the land of Canaan. Could God not, in theory at least, have decided to move the Israelites to some barren, uninhabited part of Arabia? Of course he could have. There were places quite literally just over the Red Sea where they landed, of course, in Arabia, that were inhabited by no one. No, he chooses to bring them to Canaan for a purpose and a reason. And that was to redeem it. Because ultimately what this command indicates is that the path to redemption is possible by the grace of God. That even Canaan, in the general sense, could be redeemed. Judgment came upon evil. Evil was driven out by the righteous. But the inherent goodness of that which undergirded or underlied it was to then be redeemed. And the very same trees which were, say for example in the case of the vineyards, used for wine, that was then used in the sacrifices and the temple rituals to Baal, right? To the drunken orgies of the temple prostitutes, so on and so forth, were now to be used for the worship of the one true God. This gives, loudly and clearly for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, the proclamation of hope. That is what this is saying. Hope. Now, of course, last week we particularly looked at the fact that there comes a point in the affairs of the world, much as we might despise the reality of it, where peace is no longer an option, where war is the only thing that unfortunately remains, where evil must be defeated, evil must be vanquished, evil must be conquered. Not just for the good of the righteous, but for the good of mankind. Right? The justifications and the teachings of that were made manifestly obvious last week. But ultimately this is in the purpose of, as I say, hope. Because even amidst the darkest of times, which of course the horrors of war, like last week's passage, count very much toward, even against overwhelming odds that the Israelites faced, even against mighty foes that in their own mortal right they had no meaningful capacity to defeat. Even in the face of all of that, hope was what they were being inspired by. Because when, of course, we lose hope, even indeed as they did at certain times, all that remains is failure. Right? The first and then the ultimate and the final defeat is in the heart of man. It is not in the world around us. Okay? We may suffer many defeats, but it is the failure of quitting and giving up, of the relinquishing of hope, that is the final and fatal defeat. Right? Things like wars are won first in the heart and the mind before they ever won upon the battlefield. We talked about that a fortnight ago in regard to the command concerning the cowards. Right? In warfare, cowards get people killed. Because of their cowardice, their failure to uphold their duty and responsibilities on the battlefield tactically, they put their teammates' lives at risk. Right? The failure in the heart is the final proverbial, pardon the pun, nail in the coffin. But while these images of hope remain, there is hope that can be latched onto. There is hope that can be had. And it comes first by doing here what Moses is commanding the Israelites to do. That phrase I mentioned earlier. Remember. To remember the past. To remember the promises that God made to our forefathers. Right? In our context here, like we talk about many times, that comes up in sermons and elsewhere, right? Any Christian who does not have their head buried in the sand sees the great evils that are replete throughout our society. They see all the things that, again, we would be here forever even just listing. They see the utter sexual degeneracy of our culture. They see unbridled political corruption. They see all manner of pagan religions being imported in great hordes into a formerly Christian land. They see the decay and indeed seeming destruction of faith amongst the people. You can see even the statistics of the demographics of a people having gone from 98% Christian this time 100 years ago to now being in a minority. Right? In one of the most rapid transformations that the world has ever seen. Right? Just an overwhelming tsunami, a tidal wave of apostasy. Right? All these kinds of things, and 10,000 between. This is the kind of darkness that indeed the Israelites faced with Canaan before them. Powerful, dark and evil enemies who control all manner of things. In fact, control, quite frankly, almost everything at this point. The temptation is toward despair. The temptation is toward hopelessness. Right? Is why I've often spoken in the context of the young people and their own despairs, right? Their hopelessness. Right? The single most common reason given for any young man who kills himself in terms of any note that he happens to leave is the word useless. No ability to actually do anything. Right? Constantly being told in that example through school of how inherently bad they are, constantly then assailed against by everything from politics to education to work and employment, so on and so forth. Right? And they're not the only ones. Right? Our young women are being assaulted and assailed in the mind in other ways as well. Right? All of this has been designed, quite frankly, to demoralize you, to bring you down, to destroy us. But victory begins by remembering that history is not confined to the day in which we happen to currently live. Because if we do indeed look upon the world around us as if we have arrived at the end of history and that this is all that's left, we will be conquered by despair. There will be no hope to have other than the vague illusion of something beyond this life. But even by that point, we are now already down the garden path toward that Gnosticism that I warned us against earlier. No, instead, by remembering that which God has done before us and before our time, we can see that God is faithful. Because when he is calling them to remember the planting of the trees in the days of Abraham, what is he really calling them to do? He's not actually as much calling them to remember Abraham as he is calling them to remember the God of Abraham. Does that make sense? Yeah. God was faithful to your ancestors. Has God somehow lost his ability to do these things now? Well, the answer, of course, we know that is what? No. Right. In our case, this poses a very interesting scenario. By our case, I mean Australians, right? I could talk about this in some general globalistic sense, but I'm an Australian ministering to Australians. Right? The question that I have actually been asked on more than one occasion, either in this general wording or even in the direct wording, right, poses the idea or the question of, well, if this is all going to hell in a handbasket for us right now as Australians, and we see what's happening in places like the United States, we see what's happening in the United Kingdom, we see what's happening in Europe, we see all kinds of things that, as I said, unless you have your head buried in the sand, Christians just generally now have alighted to one degree or another, right? In all the things I mentioned earlier regarding sin and evil and atheism and paganism and so on and so forth, right? If these things are happening, is it over? But in our case, why have this thing called Australia? Why do this where you bring a people in one of the greatest naval journeys and expeditions in the history of the world, quite literally, in the case of the First Fleet, travel them 24,000 kilometres to the other side of the planet on 11 ships with 1,400 people, taking 250 days to then settle them in a land that eventually, fast forward 200 and something years later, 230 odd years later, all comes crashing down. Is that really God's purpose for us? Has God brought us, and in our case now for many of us, or even perhaps all of us, our ancestors, to this Antipodean continent to just simply allow us to languish and to fall and be utterly destroyed? Well, we should never presume God's salvation. We should definitely never presume his grace and his mercy. But I do genuinely think that it is entirely valid, and not just valid, but in fact actually true, that God did not bring the light of Christianity to this land in the late 18th century, to simply allow it to be extinguished from this land. I am not convinced by history, nor by the actions and behaviours of the Almighty, that he would be so careless and so flippant and so wanton. I'm not convinced that the grace and mercy of the salvation in Jesus Christ alighted upon a land that for thousands of years had been cut off from the rest of the world and had been drowning in the mire of its own pagan darkness. I'm not convinced that God would allow the single fastest and greatest nation-building enterprise that the world has ever seen to then allow it to be merely destroyed because of the fickle frailties and faults of us as people. Not because we deserve it, because in fact we deserve the opposite. We've talked many times before about that. If this entire thing crumbles around us and we are utterly destroyed and wiped out, God will have done nothing wrong. There should be no illusion among Christians regarding that particular reality. We have so thoroughly abandoned God that there would be no injustice in his abandonment of us. But we see time and time again that when certain peoples fail, or usually as it usually goes, certain generations fail, God does not necessarily consequently condemn their descendants to the same fate. Because after all, the very people that we're reading of in Deuteronomy, they are the descendants of those who had utterly forgotten the God of Abraham. who 5 minutes after landing in the safety of Sinai, of course, now are fashioning a golden calf, a bull, from Egypt and bowing down and worshipping it as the God that brought them out of Egypt. No, God condemned that generation, especially through the rebellion of Korah later on. But did he abandon Joshua and the other children and grandchildren? No. Because God's grace, as we're learning in our Bible study in the book of Romans, is greater than mankind's sin. Why on earth? To me, no idea. By no idea, I mean figuratively, of course. Why on earth he is so patient and long-suffering when we don't deserve it. Why on earth he redeems people despite their just blindingly obvious apostasy and abandonment of him stretches even beyond the mind of this theologian. But it is, alas, and unquestionably, who he is. So then, like this command that is being given to finish for our time here today, the Israelites are being given hope. And that hope comes from remembering who God is and what God has done. That is what is being called. Right? Without that, there is no hope. Right? This is not just simply the idea of, oh, well, God will take care of it. No. That is a very dangerous presumption that many people have fatally made throughout history. That is not what is being said here. Right? The hope comes from a genuine return, spiritually speaking, right, in terms of the spiritual constitution, back to the God of our ancestors. That gets outside of ourself, that gets outside of our current failures, that gets outside of all the various things that are being done against us as Christians by the powers of darkness, both human and demonic. And it remembers that God has already defeated the powers of darkness in his crucifixion and his resurrection. It remembers that God has then sent forth his kingdom through his apostles, then his disciples, his people, right? Missionaries all throughout the world, including and most powerfully among what is for many of us our ancestors. Right? That he is, through his grace and his power, built up faithful civilizations and peoples that have known God, that have worshipped God, that have served God, that have built everything you see around you. Right? The fact that we live in the corpse of a formerly great civilization does not mean that we have been abandoned to destitution and destruction. It will if we don't change. But the question is, can things change? Could it change for the Israelites who were wandering through the death of the wilderness, quite literally the valley of death in the case of the wilderness? Were they simply abandoned to the famine and the thirst and the destitution of that wilderness? No. Were they left in Egypt to suffer in the brainwashed spell of the Egyptian culture they'd been ingratiated in? No. Because we are much like them. We're not so much like Canaan as much as we are like those in Egypt. We have forgotten God. We look around us and see a world, see a society that we think just popped into existence out of the 17th dimension, failing to understand that everything we know and love, from the architecture to the art to the education to the justice, the law, everything was built by nothing other than Christianity, by Christians specifically. Though what we see around us may fall, the question is, will we be destroyed in the process? The answer this is giving to you, dear Christian, is not necessarily. If we remember the God of our ancestors, if we remember the God of our forefathers, and live accordingly, if we renew ourselves spiritually, if we, like the fruit trees, begin to bear fruit once more by the grace of God, then there is always hope there is always the light that will dawn over the horizon of the dark night around us. That's what's being said. And so let us remember the God of our ancestors, known of old, in order that we might be able to renew within ourselves individually, within ourselves collectively, and then ultimately within our people, that which has made us Australians. The faith of Jesus Christ. Amen.